What is up, Planeswalkers? Theox6 back with some more Magic the Gathering Arena. Today we're going to jump into the mono black starter deck, and just like all of the other ones, we are going to start off by showing off the base starter deck, just so everyone knows exactly what we are going through. And this starter deck actually I think is probably one of the stronger ones starting off, because it has a really decent zombie theme. It includes two awesome lords, right? Now, well, before we talk about that, we also going to show off the consistency, and essentially what I'm trying to do here is to make the deck a little bit more consistent. As you can see, we haven't really played off too much of the themes. We've just tried to make sure that our threats were a little bit more consistent, you know, having those really early ones being more guaranteed, so that when we go later into the game and we start murdering things and strangling with spores, we're in a position that our opponent probably doesn't have too much value going on, and we can use Gravedigger to kind of finish them off. But essentially, this is just trying to make the deck a little bit more consistent. But this one was very easy to upgrade. One, because the theme of zombies was heavily explored in Amonkhet block, and two, the base was decent to work from. So starting off, we have 4 Diregraf Ghouls. This is a zombie, and it's an aggressive card. What you'll tend to see with these starter decks, unless they're explicitly made otherwise, is that we're going to be focusing on a relatively aggressive strategy. This is because the lower rarity cards don't lend themselves very well to the higher end curve. We'll see that a lot of the commons and uncommons in the 6, 7, and 8 mana range don't impact the board as much as their rare and mythic counterparts. However, the lower end common and uncommons are relatively similar in power level to their rare counterparts. You can look at something like Diregraf Ghoul and compare it with Dread Wanderer. Now, obviously, Wanderer has one distinct advantage, and that is you can replay it from your graveyard. This is obviously a very good card and a pretty decent upgrade against Diregraf Ghoul. However, it at least has the downside of only having 1 toughness. Now, this doesn't matter all the time, but you will definitely find in some situations a Diregraf Ghoul will save you more often than a Dread Wanderer, because of the fact that it has that additional 1 toughness. So a lot of the times, the lower end commons and uncommons scale relatively well with the rares and mythics. That's why you'll tend to see the aggressive decks run a great deal more commons and uncommons when compared to the control decks, or the mid-range style decks even. Then we're running Fatal Push. This is very great for us. What we found with some of the other lists as well is that a lot of the decently ubiquitous removal, at least at the lower end, was a decent rarity. We do have cards like Vrask's Contempt and Never to Return, which are rares, which are very good cards. However, some of the staple removal is uncommon, so we are able to throw in some Fatal Pushes, and I assume that a lot of our creatures are going to die. So this is going to help us in both the early and mid game. We are running 2 Festering Mummies, and I've said several times in the previous new player videos that you want to make sure that you're trying to keep your decks as consistent as possible. So I talk a lot about having 3-ofs and 4-ofs, and trying to minimize your 2-ofs and 1-ofs. Now, I'm very glad, actually, that we've gotten to this point where I can start talking about reasons you might run 1-ofs and 2-ofs. A few of the reasons essentially involve how often you want to see these cards in relation to others. So, essentially, Diregraf Ghoul is our premier 1-drop because it has 2 power. Festering Ghoul does not have 2 power, so we don't want to see it nearly as often. However, we do want a critical mass of 1-drops that we can attack with. Now, obviously, if we were using rare cards, Dread Wanderer would fit in pretty nicely, and I would assume after a certain amount of time, you would end up probably having a 3-3 split, maybe a 4-2 split of Dread Wanderer in Diregraf Ghoul, or if you wanted to be super aggressive, you would definitely have a 4-4 split. But Festering Mummy essentially is copies 5 and 6 of Diregraf Ghoul. It's not really meant to be seen as a card in and of its own right, so it's not really a 2-of. It is just essentially an additional, albeit worse, copy of a card we already run. So that's one reason you might want to run 2-ofs. Another reason is so the like description essentially of that reason is that you just want a certain number of effect. and there is a card that has a similar effect but is slightly worse, or is slightly different. So, for example, Duress and Divest, and maybe you run 3 of one and 3 of the other, or 2 of one and 2 of the other, so maybe because they do slightly different things, you're going to want them in different ratios. So that is one reason you might run 2 ofs. Another reason is the legendary status. So sometimes a legend is very good and your deck draws a lot, but you never want to have more than one copy of that card. You'll want to see it sometimes, but not all the time. So a legend essentially just make sure you're not going to have too many of those copies in your hand if you're only running 2. Similarly to the legend reason is maybe you don't want to see a card every single game. So this is something like a Silver Bullet, which is actually a bit more ubiquitous in best of 1 formats, which I suggest you play before you end up playing best of 3. You will want Silver Bullets against very specific situations. For example, if for some reason you are running something like Lost Legacy in best of 1, and I really should, since I'm talking about this card in a new player context, I should go find it. It's like right here, yeah. If you are running Lost Legacy in a best of 1 format, just because maybe there are certain decks that you really can't deal with, there are certain decks that you come across frequently, so it's kind of worth diluting your deck a bit. You may not want to have this card in every single matchup, but you might want it in very specific situations. And having something like this at 2 or 1 allows you to see it some of the time, but not too often that it ends up actually hemorrhaging your win percentage. So that essentially is a few of the reasons why you might want to run 2 ofs. However, for the most part, you do want to stick to 4 ofs and 3 ofs. Next, we move on to 4 Doomed Dissenters. I was trying to decide whether or not I wanted to put in Khenra Eternal, I think is what it's called. Where are you at? Khenra, I believe in you. There we go. It is also a common. I feel it's stronger. I do know some people swear by Doomed Dissenter, because if they remove it, you do end up getting another creature out of it. So it's kind of resilient to board wipes, but this is a little bit more aggressive. So that's kind of why I like that. But the reason I decided not to is, even though these are just commons, there is still a cost associated with them. So I wanted to keep Doomed Dissenter in because it's fine enough, and it does keep the total aggregate wild card cost down. Goodness me, that was difficult to say. My suggestion, personally, if you're coming up against a lot of removal spells or a lot of board wipes, to stick with Doomed Dissenter. However, if you are not, I believe that Khenra Eternal is a generally better card. Then we get to 4 Wretched Camels. Now, I should mention that essentially all of the cards that we've gone through at this point either are zombies or create zombies, which is very important because this is a zombie deck. There were a few vampires in the base deck, which we did not need. Period. Also, Fatal Push got rid of Skulduggery because Skulduggery is not as strong of a card in the majority of situations. Now, Wretched Camel also works fantastically in this deck because we have deserts. We are running a lot of the desert lands, very similar to when we were running that enchantment card in the white version with deserts, because the deserts themselves were fine to run, and there's actually more deserts in this deck than the mono white deck, and they give us a little bit of an additional synergy value. So Wretched Camel by itself isn't a very strong card. It's technically weaker than normal Grizzly Bear, a 2-mana 2/2, right? However, the potential value you get when you have this card die against, or when you have a desert out, is absolutely fantastic. It's absolutely worth that single point of toughness. Otherwise, it is just a fine card. If you do have a desert out, it's very likely that your opponent is not going to want to actively block. So this card does kind of have pseudo evasion, since your opponent would have to be blocking and then losing one of the cards in their hand, and especially in the mid game when their hand is a little bit more thin, where there's less kind of throwaway cards, your opponent's going to have a difficult time wanting to block this. Additionally, if you decide that you're on the back ropes, you can leave this card back as a blocker and kind of dissuade your opponent from attacking into you, because you have this as some sort of like, hey, if you attack, I'm going to block and you're going to lose a card in your hand. So this is definitely a card that's going to be skill testing for you, and you'll want to really take note of when it works and when it doesn't, how well you're using it in different situations. Then we move on to 2 Cursed Minotaurs. So another reason that I should say to only run 2 ofs is when you have to like modify your curve. Now, initially I was going to put 4 of these cards in because they're fine cards, right? It's a decent 3-drop for a zombie deck. However, because we have several lords as well as several removal spells in the 3-drop slot, but we don't have the rare wild cards, technically, to create more Death Barons for the deck, we run into a situation where we have a large number of 3-drops, and we don't want to tip our curve too much. So instead of just saying, well, I'm not going to run any because Bierek said not to run 4-drops, instead say 2 is still fine, it supplements my 3-drop spot, but it doesn't become overbearing. Now, if you wanted to, you could make the deck a little bit more aggressive by cutting those 2 Cursed Minotaurs and upping your 2-drop count. However, it is not necessarily necessary. And I do like the fact that it does have Menace, so it will help you out of some kind of fringe scenarios where you're able to get through because your opponent, say, only has 1 creature or something. Or if you have both of these out, it's very difficult to commit all 4 blockers to this. So then 2 Death Barons. This is fantastic that this card came with the set because, or with this individual deck, because of how strong it is in this deck. Unfortunately, it does only have 2 toughness, unlike Lord of the Accursed, so it does die to a few more burn spells, but you're essentially almost never going to be attacking with this card. Now, you might think, why would I run a card that I don't plan on attacking with? And that's because of the fact that, as a Lord, it's very important. If you play a 1-drop and a 2-drop and then play this on 3, you are getting 2 power as soon as you play this card across your 2 bodies, right? So essentially, this card has a type of haste, right? As soon as you play it, you're able to attack with your 1-drop and 2-drop, and get in not only for the damage that those creatures have innately, but also the extra damage that this card gives them. Furthermore, it dissuades your opponent from blocking and attacking because it gives your zombies, your relatively small creatures, Death Touch. So when you're facing a deck, especially a deck that might have a little bit better creatures than you because you are playing essentially a budget deck, their creatures very well could be larger than yours. And the fact that you're able to trade up, so you're trading maybe a 1, 2, or 3-drop for their 3, 4, or 5-drop, is incredibly valuable. The amount of tempo, potential tempo gained from a swing like that is very valuable. Essentially, you're never going to get in with this card unless you kind of need to alpha strike, unless you need to attack with everyone in just to surpass the amount of blockers that they have. For the most part, because of how weak this individual Lord is, I would suggest not attacking with him. And we're going to skip Doomfall for a second so we can talk about the other Lord in the deck, Lord of the Accursed. Now, this deck is, as I said already, pretty well equipped because of the theme of the deck that they chose. Lord of the Accursed is an uncommon Lord, so not only do we have a nice rare Lord, we have an uncommon one. And an uncommon one that's actually relatively strong. Unfortunately, it's not a 2-drop Lord like we see from some of the Ixalan tribes with merfolk and, vampires and things. However, it does have 3 toughness, and that's something that those other lords do not have. The 3 toughness means it dies to way fewer burn spells, right? It'll die to Lightning Strike and Abrade, but it won't die to Shock. And Shock's running around everywhere. Magma Spray as well, it doesn't die to those cards. It doesn't die to anything that gives -2/-2. So it's a relatively resilient card, and for that reason, you're able to attack with it a little bit more frequently than you're able to attack with Death Baron. Additionally, Death Baron is something you're almost never going to be able to block with either because of how small it is. Whereas, if you curve turn 1, 1-drop, turn 2, 2-drop, into a Lord of the Accursed, you can attack with kind of reckless abandon, knowing that you have a semblance of a blocker on defense. A 2/3 is something that can survive bears. Obviously, it can die in some situations, so you do want to pay attention to whether or not your opponent will have mana up, and you suspect them of having a combat trick, but this card is a lot safer to attack and block with. Moving forward, we can talk about the fact that this card doesn't give your zombies pseudo evasion with Death Touch, and doesn't give them that additional ability, but it gives them actual evasion with its tap ability to give Menace. Now, This one is an activated ability, whereas Death Barons is a passive ability, meaning Death Barons always on, Lord of the Accursed you have to pay mana for, and tap it, which sometimes can be concerning, right? You are tapping down a card that you could potentially attack with in order to make your zombies less easy to block. However, if you have a board of just 2 zombies, and, excuse me, 2 zombies plus Lord of the Accursed, and you activate this card's ability, your opponent then has to have 4 blockers to be able to effectively not take any damage. If they have 3 blockers, at least one of your zombies is almost guaranteed to get through, pending, of course, any types of removal or anything like that. If you do Lord of the Accursed in conjunction with Death Baron, then not only will your creatures have Menace, but they'll also have Death Touch. And the way Death Touch works is you only have to assign a single point of damage to either creature. So if you have a 2-power creature and your opponent is, or you have 2 2-power creatures plus the lords, and you give them Menace, they then have to have 4 creatures not only block, but die because they have Death Touch. So Lord of the Accursed works really well with Death Baron. Just like the other decks, I will suggest focusing on getting your 3rd and 4th copies of Death Baron before anything else. And the other rare that you should really focus on getting after you get those cards is way over here in 5 somewhere. This is not 5 yet. It's fine, guys. I can do math. There we go. This is the other card that you'll want to get with your rare wild cards. And either of the Lilianas, if you really want to use your mythic rare wild cards in this deck, either of the Lilianas are absolutely fine. However, Liliana's Mastery is a card that just kind of is difficult to deal with. It's kind of a lord. It's 5 mana for 6 power worth of guys because the creatures come in with the buff on them. So it's a very strong card. This is the essentially first thing I would suggest crafting if you decide to go for this deck. Going back to the deck, Doomfall is essentially just a helpful way to get rid of cards that are a little bit too strong for you to deal with. Unfortunately, your opponent gets to choose what creature they exile. However, not all the time your opponent's going to have several creatures. And if you're able to attack with something, say with Death Touch, and your opponent has 2 creatures and they choose to block, with one of the weaker creatures, you can then use Doomfall to kill their actual good creature that was more difficult for you to deal with. And the fact that it exiles means that you can get through things like Gods, Hazaret and Scarab God. The other version allows you to pick apart your opponent's hand. So if you are worried about Settle the Wreckage, for example, if your opponent, if it's your turn and you're wanting to attack, and your opponent has 2 white mana and 2 of any other mana available, you might want to do this before you end up attacking to see if they have that Settle the Wreckage, to see if the coast is clear to attack with all of your creatures. It's just a generally powerful removal card. Murder is not a terribly strong removal card. I would suggest upgrading it as, kind of soon as possible after you get the masteries with either Vraska's Contempt or, goodness me, what's the Never to Return. Both of those cards are better removal spells that will help. Murder is a totally fine murder spell. Is a totally fine kill spell. In the meantime, though, Gravedigger. Now, Gravedigger, not one of the best cards. This is essentially what you should be replacing with Liliana's Mastery. However, Gravedigger was in the main deck, and Gravedigger is not terrible. And the reason it's not terrible is because it should only ever get back your lords. Right? If your lords do end up dying, you have Gravedigger to rebuy them, and that's essentially the entire reason they're in here. Open the Graves is one of the cards that came with the deck, and it's not a terrible card. I would suggest cutting it for Liliana's Mastery. I do suggest getting 3 if you are going to include some Planeswalkers, 4 if you aren't. But whenever one of your creatures die, it's going to be very difficult for your opponent to stem the bleeding because you're going to get a token from it, right? So if you and if you curve all the way out, right, 1 drop, 2 drop, 3 drop, 4 drop, open the Graves, you're going to have a decent board, and your opponent is not going to want to Wrath, because then your board has essentially not been affected. So Open the Graves is a fine card. Gravewaker is also kind of a fine card. A 6 mana 5/5 flyer is pretty decent, and it does allow you to use some of your mana late game if you do end up flooding out. You're not very often going to get to 7 mana, just because this deck does only run 24 lands, and it is an aggressive deck. So you're probably going to be dead before you get a chance to actually activate this card. But it can, since it does have innate evasion, it can actually help. I'm a little annoyed that it's a bird spirit and not a bird zombie. If it was like a vulturous bird zombie, I think the card would be a lot better. Holy crap, I've been talking for 20 minutes. I am trying to make sure that these videos are as informative as possible on each individual card choice. You know, I want to make sure new players know not only that they should play these cards, but why they should play them. So Desert of the Glorified, very similar to the Desert of the True in the white video. This is a card that will sometimes screw up your draws, but not very frequently. But it also is something that if you're flooding out, you can cycle it and try to get something better. If Near Deadlands is a card that is similar to Shepherd Dunes, very strong in certain circumstances. If Near Deadlands, in my opinion, is stronger in more circumstances. You're able to just get rid of some creatures, even if ones that are indestructible, or make them small enough that you're not worried about attacking in with your zombies. Additionally, this works with Desert of the Glorified and Dunes of the Dead, which I'll talk about in just a moment, to make it so that one Ifnir can end up putting several different layers of counters on either the same creature or different ones over the course of the game. Dunes of the Dead is a fantastic card to sack to Ifnir Deadlands, and essentially is only in here to do that and to up our desert count to work with Wretched Camel. Dunes of the Dead, when sacrificed to Ifnir Deadlands, gets you a zombie token. So not only are you getting some reduction in power and toughness on an opponent's creature, but you're also getting additional value out of it. So Ifnir Deadlands becomes tap 5, get a 2/2 zombie with Enter the Battlefield, -2/2. That's a fantastic deal. And then, of course, 16 swamps. Now, I have talked probably more than enough about the deck. Let us go ahead and jump into it. Now, one word of warning. Because this deck is a decent deck, you know, Mono Black Zombie is something that I actively play, you're likely going to be matched up. You're going to be matched up with I Worship Chaos. You're likely going to be matched up with slightly better decks than what you would have been matched up with, for example, on the blue deck. So this hand is actually not terrible. It might look bad at first glance, but because we have two deserts here, so what we can do is on turn 1, since we don't have a turn 1 play, we can go ahead and play this desert tapped, and following turn play this into a camel, and immediately, right off the bat, our opponent will not want to deal with this card. Additionally, you might think, well, we have too many lands in our hand, but we only need one desert on the field. The second one we can just use as a cycler, and the fact that we have Death Baron makes this card even scarier. So we're going to go ahead and keep this one. So let's see what Chaos would like to do here. Chaos thinking long and hard about the mulligan decision, and that's something you should do. If you're a newer player, definitely look at each individual card in your hand, as well as looking at it in an aggregate sense. You want to see if the individual cards in your hand are strong enough by themselves, and if they're strong enough together to potentially win you the game with just a couple more cards in your deck. You want to look at a hand and say, can I win with this opening hand and about 2 or 3 more cards? So we're going up in blue-red, very possibly a Wizard's deck. Alright. So we have this, and we have a desert, so it's likely our opponent is not going to be wanting to kill this, except maybe with a Magma Spray, because Magma Spray will exile this instead of it dying, right? When it's exiled as a replacement effect, so it doesn't actually ever hit the graveyard. So if your Wretched Camel gets Magma Sprayed and you don't get the effect, this is why. Because it gets exiled. Now we have an interesting decision to make next turn. We can either play Doomed Dissenter and Diregraf Ghoul, or we can play Death Baron. The reason we're going to play Diregraf Ghoul and Doomed Dissenter first is because, one, if our opponent does decide to wipe the board, we at least have a 2/2, right? Whereas if we play this and they wipe the board, we do get them to discard, but we would have got them to discard in both situations, so it's not really a benefit. Additionally, we don't want to attack with Death Baron, so deploying Death Baron now will only be +1 power the turn it comes down. Deploying Death Baron later is going to be +2 power, plus the fact that we have a Doomed Dissenter ready to attack. So that's why we are planning on playing these first. Something else you guys should be doing is when your opponent is taking their turn, look at what different options you have at your disposal. Our opponent did nothing. Very unfortunate for my opponent. And so the reason you want to think about what you might want to do on your opponent's turn is just to be able to play faster. But it's also so that you can think about how it changes when you get another card. So we got a Wretched Camel. So we're probably going to play Wretched Camel instead, because yes, it's going to be weaker to avoid Wipe in general, but the fact that our opponent didn't play anything on their second turn means that, well, it just means that they kept a bad hand, or they weren't paying attention. I'm not entirely sure what it means. My opponent could just be roping, which is unfortunate because this is a very good hand, right? Well, we'd be able to play Ghoul and Camel, and the following turn we'd have this being +3, right, across 3 creatures. And if our opponent board wiped, they would lose 2 cards in their hand. So it'd be a total of 3 cards lost, you know, from the board wipe and that, and we'd only technically be losing 4. So it wouldn't be too bad of a deal. But it does seem our opponent is roping, which is very unfortunate. It's possible that they messed up or something. No, they're back. I'm very confused, but sure, opt. If I was my opponent, I would have main phased that opt, because they could have drawn a land, right? If that's a land, they should have done this during their main phase. I've said this before. I don't know if I've said it during any of my new player videos, but just because you can play something in instant speed doesn't necessarily mean that you should, right? If that card that my opponent drew was a land, they wouldn't have had to discard, and they would have technically had the possibility of being up an additional land here. So what is this? So it's potentially a wizard deck. We don't know that for sure. Draw a card, then discard a card. Activate this only if you've cast a non-creature. Okay. So we don't necessarily need to cast or to play Desert of the Glorified. However, I don't think we're going to need the card draw either, so we're probably fine with just playing this tapped. We're also going to go ahead and play Death Baron because that is fantastic for us. It makes it so we can attack with all of these and be totally fine. Our opponent now is very much on the ropes. There isn't a ton that they can do against this board and not lose at least some value of cards in their hand. So let's see what my opponent decides to do here. It's going to be very difficult for them to get out of this, especially because I do have Murder. If they have some very good blocker, I can kill it. And unfortunately, they only have the 1, and I'm going to kill this before combat to essentially mean they have to have something or they just die. Right? We have 11 damage on board, and this would have been able to block and put them to 1, but we are forcing them to do something, or else they just die. And it looks like they just die. Now, I've said in the past, don't attack with Death Baron. I said that several times. However, my opponent could have a removal spell for, say, Wretched Camel or Diregraf Ghoul or something, that if I just attack with the others, they're not going to die. I have my opponent at such a life total that it's fine even if I lose this, because even though these all will be weaker, they should still be able to kill my opponent over the course of a few turns. So that is unfortunate. That would not have happened if I didn't attack with Death Baron. However, my opponent is still at 3. They're still playing on the reactive, right? It is going to be difficult for them to turn the tide. Because now they have to get rid of all of my creatures. Yes, okay. They would have had to essentially get rid of all of my creatures, or else playing Death Baron again would provide lethal for me. So that was essentially a textbook example. This deck really wants to curve out. It wants to play as best as it can a 1-drop, a 2-drop, a 3-drop, 2 2-drops, you know, or a 4-drop, you know. And by that point, they should have won the game, right? That's kind of the whole idea. Going up against Morani here. We're going second. Going second with an aggressive deck is not great, because your opponent is going to have more mana when you are wanting to cast things. This hand, unlike the other one, is substantially worse. And the reason is, yes, we have a turn 2 play, but we're not guaranteed a 3-play. And this card is too many lands away, and so is this. So essentially, we have to consider that these cards don't even exist, and these cards might not exist. So essentially, we're playing with a 3-land hand, and a 3-card hand. And a 6-card hand is almost always better than that. And look, this one is substantially better. We have a guaranteed 1 and a guaranteed 2. Now, Wretched Camel won't be able to activate, which is unfortunate because your opponent might kill it before you get a desert, but that's fine. Of course, this is not ideal, and we definitely don't need that. 3 lands essentially is all we need for quite a while with this deck. Obviously, this is not the most ideal start. We would want either one of these to be a desert, or for this to have been a more aggressive card, or any of these to be a little bit more aggressive, since they are just 2/1s, but it is fine. If this is the Knights deck, okay, it's not the Knights deck, but it is going to be very difficult to beat this deck. White-black life gain. I'm used to mono-white life gain, so I'm not entirely sure what the black version consists of. But I'm definitely going to be on the ropes here. So they're probably going to attack. And there's no reason to block here, right? Our life is a resource, and we don't want... My opponent might actually choose... Okay. And I don't want to lose this for no reason. Alright, we got this. At this point, I don't actually think it's profitable to attack. We could maybe get through for a point of damage, but... We would much rather wait to maybe get Open the Graves. So that's unfortunate. However, if he attacks, his creature dies, right? So we're going to deal 3 damage to this, right? Our opponent made a mistake here, because my opponent didn't factor in this card, right? This is going to remove one of his +1/+1 counters. They're going to essentially cancel out. So this will have 3 toughness, and we're dealing 3 damage to it now. So this card is dead now. And we want to do this, even though we lose our entire board, our opponent is stumbling on mana, and we're getting closer and closer to being able to play Open the Graves. Now, Open the Graves, if this was Liliana's Mastery, would be an utter blowout, right? However, we do have to notice our opponent is... Okay, they did stumble on mana, but we have the Murder. We have Open the Graves for a certain point, and we're going to be able to cast almost anything in our deck. So that's an unfortunate card to see. This is actually fine, because now if this dies, we force them to discard. But this is not a card that we want in this deck. Or this is not a card that we want them to have, right? It's possible that there's stronger cards. However, we just need to start beating down on them, right? It's unfortunate. It looks like our opponent is no longer stumbling on mana. Sure, that is fine. Gravedigger. Gravedigger is fine. Although I think I would prefer to just play Open the Graves here. Yes, I think I'm going to play Open the Graves. And I'm not going to attack. The reason I'm not going to attack is they essentially would just be at parity, right? If I attack, I put them to 20, and then they attack me, and they put me down, and they go back to 22. Not attacking here means that if they wanted to... Okay, that's unfortunate. If they wanted to play in a Johnny's Pridemate and then attack, they would lose this card and a card in their hand. They should not have attacked there. My opponent might have a card in hand, but no matter what happens, if this dies, they lose a card. I don't think it was correct for my opponent to attack there. Sure. So I'll have a Fatal Push, which is helpful against several different things, and I'll just get back another Wretched Camel. You could say I should have gotten back a Festering Mummy, so I could play it immediately. However, I value the Wretched Camel more because, 1, it is technically stronger by itself, and 2, it does make them discard. Does an untap during untap step? Sure, that's fine. 2-drop. I might end up killing that. I'm now going to definitely kill that. So yeah, that just fizzles, so they get nothing out of the interaction. And then we play some zombies. And all of a sudden our board is better than our opponent's. And essentially the reason for this is because we decided very early on that we're actually not the aggressor in this matchup. We're essentially the controller in this matchup. We know that our opponent is going to get a ton of life throughout this game. We can't feasibly handle that, right? We essentially have to just hold out. Sure, that's fine. Our opponent didn't need to block there. However, the reason I made that attack, theoretically, I should have attacked with everything there, because my opponent should not have blocked. I had no idea what this card is. Sure, that's fine. My opponent was at 30. They're so far away from actually dying, they had no reason to block there, right? If they would have just accepted that damage, they would have won the race. Now, this is something very important that I didn't bring up during the deck tech that I guess I should have. Gravedigger can bring back Gravediggers, right? So if I want to, I can just loop these constantly. I'll essentially never run out of a card to play, as long as I wait till for this to die before I bring back the other one. If I get a third one, I don't have to wait. I can just keep playing them, so. A very strong interaction that I did forget to bring up. I shouldn't say strong. It is definitely strong for this level of deck. Let's see what our opponent is able to do. We made very important attacks, very important blocks. And, I mean, obviously if our opponent has something like a Lyra, it'd be very bad. I mean, this card is potentially horrible, right? If our opponent goes and gets, like, their strongest card in their deck, we need to draw a murder for it. It's very obvious that our opponent has some mythics. However, my hope is that the game wouldn't match me up with a deck that runs several Lyras. Now, they might have one, which means Razaketh's Right is fine in and of itself, right? But I would hope that this matchmaking system wouldn't square this deck specifically up with a several Lyra deck. But I at least have another turn to deal some damage. Okay, sure, that is fine. I don't... Let's see, this is 5. So they're at 19, so this is a 4-turn clock. If I put this down, I would also be able to add another creature to it. Yes, I think it's fine, because it speeds up my clock by a turn, right? Because it was 4-turn clock. And now, 2, 4, 6, 9. Now it's a 3-turn clock. It would be a 2-turn clock, but... So let's see what my opponent searched for. Okay, there's like no way it was that. Okay, it might have been that. But this taps it, right? Tap, yeah, it has tap. So... I'm gonna... I'm just gonna kill this now. Alright. So maybe our opponent did? Yeah, I guess that's the card that they searched for? I guess that was the best card they could have had. So that was pretty, pretty decent. You definitely want to evaluate whether or not you're the aggressor. Now, I said, typically when you're playing a budget deck, you're going to be aggressor. However, it's not even just matchup dependent. It's board state dependent. Going up against Agent Hunt here, right? That or Johnny's Pridemate could have gotten out of control, and if our opponent showed a little bit of restraint, or at least read the card a little bit better, they likely would have won that game. This is a good hand. Unfortunately, essentially we have to play as if this card doesn't exist. But we go with first, which is very important. And we have a relatively aggressive start. We have a Diregraf Ghoul into a Wretched Camel, right? We have a 1 and a 2. And we have the ability to kill one of our opponent's creatures. And even though this doesn't technically count as a card in our hand right now, because it's unlikely we're going to cast it, this is a card that, if we flood out, we will be able to cast. So this is a fine hand. And what we're looking for essentially is getting any of our 3-drops, right? All we really need is any of our 3-drops, and then if we draw nothing else but land until Gravedigger, that's totally fine. Opponent's on some sort of green, potentially. If Near Dead Lands is fantastic. It's unfortunate that it was a land that we drew. However, it's fantastic because it is a desert, and it turns on our camel. So if our camel ends up dying, our opponent's going to lose a card. So now let's see what our opponent does here. They do nothing. Okay, very good. It's unfortunate that we drew another land. However, it does mean that we're that much more likely to cast Gravedigger this game. And potentially, all we need is to whittle them down a little bit, like we're doing, land a Gravedigger, and green doesn't have the easiest of time dealing with that. It is a little unfortunate that that this is a 3-drop, because I cannot Fatal Push it unless one of my creatures dies. Got another Deadland. I'll go ahead and play it. So we do have enough mana to cast Gravedigger eventually. But I don't want this to die right now. Because I don't have anything to use Fatal Push on, so I would much rather attack with just my Ghoul. And potentially Fatal Push a 4-drop creature. Unfortunately, they can go into a 5-drop creature next turn, which is going to be difficult to deal with. We will have the ability to, if Near Deadlands it, to make it smaller. But let's see what they play. Because they didn't have anything until 3. Interesting. Okay. Sure. That is fine. So now I'm more likely to attack with my camel, because I will be able to Fatal Push the other one. Rabid Bite. Sure. That is fine. I still Fatal Push that. And you're going to lose a card. So they 2-for-1 themselves, right? They killed my camel, sure. But they... Oh, okay. Well, it was a land that they got rid of. Yeah, I mean, I'll go ahead and Fatal Push this. I don't really see a need necessarily to keep it. Now I could if Near Deadlands, but I'm not going to. Oh, that is a fantastic draw. I will actually play it post-combat. The reason I'm playing it post-combat is I don't want to give my opponent information in this specific scenario. So let's go ahead and get back our camel. I would like to take that action. But yeah, back to what I was saying. You want to evaluate every matchup and see whether or not you're going to be the aggressor. And in the Lifegain, ooh, goodness me. So luckily, this doesn't have trample, nor does it have reach. So let's see, they already used Rabid Bite. They used a Rabid Bite. I'm worried about this getting Rabid Bited, but I do have more Gravediggers, so I'm just going to play this because it would kill my opponent in 2 turns. So I'm going to have to just not attack and hope my opponent doesn't have a Rabid Bite, another Rabid Bite in their hand. And just the top 15 cards, that's relatively unlikely, but it looks like they have it. See, that's incredibly unfortunate. But if they attack here with this, I'd probably just... Okay, that's not great. Do I want to take 17? Not really. Ooh, that is difficult. I guess I will block with this. Yeah. So Fatal Push is decent here. We'll be able to kill that. So I'm going to block this again. Kill this. I'm not sure if I'm able to attack, though. So I think I just have to pass the turn because I might end up dying. So initially we were the aggressor, but because of their frankly good draws... Oh, that's terrible. Because of their very, very good draws, we kind of just lose, unfortunately. I don't think anything I could have done necessarily. You could say like wait on the Gravedigger to get back your strong card. However, I just don't think there's anything we could have done. That's 17 damage. We have 3 to block, so that's still 14. So yeah, no, we just die. Yeah, I mean, it happens. And you really should look at those situations as not being any mistake you made. I don't think that we made any mistakes that game. Sometimes your opponent just has it. And I'm gonna go in for a 4th and final game. Going up against End Dark. Relatively edgy name. Hey, I'm not one to talk. I used to be an edgelord. This is a find hand. We have 1-drop into tap land 1-drop into 3-drop 3-drop, and we go first. So it's a relatively aggressive hand, pretty decent to keep. So this essentially, it's essentially a bear, right? When you play a 2-mana 2/2, right? You're not necessarily going to be able to attack with it on the first turn you play it anyway. So having it come in tapped doesn't necessarily matter unless you're expecting on needing a blocker. So having this be our turn 2 play is essentially no different than playing a 2-mana 2/2, because we're not expecting to need to block, right? So we did kind of just play a 2-drop. And then we have the decent 3-drop of Death Baron. And we're going up against a deck with walls. We are kind of flooding out, which is unfortunate, but remember, you need to evaluate your hands as if you're not going to draw like anything else in the game, right? It's very important that you have that mindset of, I might not draw anything else. And hilariously, this wall, we don't care about it. Our creatures have Death Touch. That dies. Au revoir. So, very, very strong ability right there. Well, let's see what my opponent has. Alright, they have a Sigh. Once again, Sigh is something we do not care about. Because we have Gravedigger, we're going to be fine getting in there with Death Baron because we can just buy it back. Additionally, it means that we're going to get through for more damage because this for sure can't kill this. So we are just going to attack. If he blocks one of these to save damage, this dies. If he blocks this, he takes 6. He blocked none of it. What might that mean? He had like no reason. Oh, he might have decided not to block there because of something like Skulduggery. So that wasn't a terrible play on our opponent's part if they have a response. It's very possible I shouldn't have played that card, but I'm playing what appears to be a mono blue artifact themed deck, and they're unlikely to have a board wipe, like a true board wipe. Sure, that is fine. And we knew that because of Sigh, we might need to have something with, say, Menace that we have to get through with some additional attackers. Okay. So yeah, I mean this is going to eat up two of his blocks, right? Doomed Dissenter is nice. Even though our Death Baron can die, I do think that we just attack with everything here. Because this eats up probably just 2 chumps. This gets blocked. This might get through. And then we just play Death Baron, buy this back. I do think it's correct to make this decision. It is likely that Death Baron will die. Probably just to the Foundry Inspector. But as I said, our opponent is on the back foot. Right? They're not doing well. They don't even have much, like a ton of cards more in their hand than I do. So they're just not going to be in for a fantastic time. Next turn, they will be able to, if Sai is still alive, still be able to sacrifice this, get an artifact, draw a card. Well, this is sacrifice 2, doesn't it? Yeah, so they wouldn't even really be able to do that. They're just ignoring that card completely. For who? For that? Sure, yeah. I want one of them to die. Sure. So they did just take 4. But as predicted, that died and I was able to just get it back. So they are still going to need... They're going to need to produce enough blockers for all of my creatures. That's 5. They need to have 5 total blockers. That's unfortunate. They have to have fewer blockers now. But I mean, they're still not out of it. That might help. That... Oh, no, my creatures are going to have Death Touch, so my opponent is going to be able to get one good block in with this. But that's it. Because my creatures have Death Touch, I get to essentially kill whatever of theirs I want. So, yeah, once again, my creatures have Death Touch. I'm just playing this now because who cares? And I will, once again, attack with all of them. At this point, we've kind of put on the aggression, so we need to keep that up. If we let up just a little bit, our opponent might have enough wiggle room to stabilize and stay in the game. And we don't have to worry about this too much, because it's going to die. Our creatures have Death Touch. He's tapped out. Right, so... Let's see what our opponent does here. The problem is, Sai is definitely giving us a headache. Sure, that makes the most sense, yeah. Sure, yeah, that makes sense. Now, interestingly, he doesn't actually have to block with everything here. Both of those are dead. Because he's at a functional 8 life, so he doesn't necessarily have to block with everything. That is interesting. I'm not sure I agree with the way they blocked there, because it leaves me with too many creatures alive, I think. I feel like he left me with too many creatures that are alive. But I mean, I could be wrong. I don't know what's in his hands. And Sai has really done work for him. As I said in yesterday's video, Sai is decent if you want to go the artifact route. Get off my screen. Yeah, but I mean, that's kind of what happens. He wasn't able to maintain a response to my creatures, and even though he wasn't dead on board, I assume, I don't think he would have been able to get through. So let us... Oh, we don't have any packs. Well, that's awkward. Usually I have packs, but today I do not. I hope that this video has been informative for both new players and enfranchised players. I would like to thank all of you for watching. I would also like to thank Easy Mode, Chris, Daniel, Flowerchild, and Chow083 for their support on Patreon. If you'd like to join them in supporting me, feel free to check out the link in the Patreon down below. Yeah, I mean, I don't think I need to have this drag on too much more. So if you like that video, go ahead and tap the like button, add a subscription to your mana pool, and cast a comment to the comment section down below. And until next time, all will be one.